Imagine waking up one morning to find that your beard, the symbol of your Orthodox faith, your manhood, your very identity, has been taxed by your own Tsar in Moscow in 1698. That was not a hypothetical. It was the law. And the question that haunts everything that follows is this: when a ruler tries to remake an entire civilization by force, does he transform it, or does he only drive the old civilization underground where it waits? Peter Alexeyevich Romanov was 26 years old when he returned to Russia from his Grand Embassy. The remarkable 18-month journey through Holland, England, Prussia, and the Habsburg lands that he undertook between 1697 and 1698. He had gone incognito, at least in theory, traveling under the name Peter Mikhailov, though his 6'7" frame made anonymity essentially impossible. He had worked in the shipyards of Zaandam and Deptford, studied artillery and anatomy, visited factories and hospitals, and watched parliaments deliberate. He came back to Russia burning with something that was part vision, part obsession, and part barely contained fury at the country he had inherited. Within weeks of his return, he was pulling the beards off his own boyars at a banquet with his own hands. This was not theater. This was a declaration of war, and the enemy was Russia itself. To understand why Peter did what he did, you have to understand what Russia looked like in 1698 to a man who had just spent a year and a half in Western Europe. The contrast was staggering, and it was not merely aesthetic. Russia had no navy to speak of, and Peter knew that naval power was the engine of European commerce and imperial projection. Its army was organized along outdated lines, relying heavily on the Streltsy, the musketeers who had served the Tsars since Ivan the Terrible's time, but who were by now a semi-hereditary caste more interested in their trading privileges than in military reform. The Orthodox Church dominated intellectual life in a way that had no parallel in Protestant Holland or Anglican England, where Peter had watched men argue freely about science, commerce, and the natural world. Russian nobles wore long robes and full beards in the Byzantine tradition, spoke Church Slavonic in formal settings, and calculated years from the supposed date of the creation rather than from the birth of Christ. Russia was, by the standards of Amsterdam or London in 1698, a different world, and Peter had decided it needed to stop being one. But here is the first complication, and it is one that historians have argued about for 3 centuries. Was Peter actually trying to make Russia more like Europe? Or was he trying to make Russia powerful enough to compete with Europe? Those are related goals, but they are not the same thing. A ruler who wants his country to be more like France values French culture for its own sake. A ruler who wants his country to be powerful enough to defeat Sweden, dominate the Baltic, and command respect at Versailles values European techniques as instruments. Peter, the evidence strongly suggests, was almost entirely in the second camp. He wanted European shipbuilding, European military drill, European administrative systems, and European tax collection, not because he admired European civilization as an end in itself, but because those tools worked. The cultural reforms, the beard tax, the Western dress codes, the new calendar, the mandatory assemblies where men and women mixed in the French style, these were partly instrumental and partly the expression of a genuine, if sometimes incoherent, Enlightenment-adjacent contempt for what he saw as Russian backwardness. But they were never the core of the project. The core was power. This distinction matters enormously because it explains why so many of Peter's reforms were simultaneously radical and shallow. He could force Russian nobles to shave their beards and wear German coats. He could not in a single reign create the social conditions that had produced those coats in the first place. Centuries of urban commercial culture, Protestant individualism, natural philosophy, and parliamentary habit. What he created instead was a kind of cultural performance, a Europeanized surface laid over an essentially unchanged social and religious foundation. And that gap between surface and substance would haunt Russia for the next 2 centuries. The Streltsy Rebellion of 1698 showed Peter exactly what he was dealing with. While he was still abroad, the Streltsy units stationed near the Polish border mutinied and marched on Moscow, apparently hoping to restore the old order or at least to remove the Tsar's foreign favorites from power. The rebellion was suppressed before Peter returned, but he was not satisfied with the outcome. He personally participated in the interrogations and executions that followed. Over 1,000 Streltsy were tortured and executed in the autumn of 1698. Their bodies were left hanging near the Kremlin walls for months. Peter was sending a message, and the message was simple: the old Russia was over. Whether Russia was ready to receive that message was another question entirely. The Northern War, which began in 1700 and would last until 1721, was the crucible in which Peter's reforms were tested and in many ways created. Peter had formed the Great Northern Alliance with Denmark and Saxony-Poland to challenge Swedish dominance of the Baltic, and in the opening months of the war, the results were catastrophic. At the Battle of Narva in November 1700, a Swedish army of roughly 8,000 men under the young King Charles XII routed a Russian force of perhaps 40,000. The Russian army collapsed in the snow and the sleet of the Estonian winter, its officers mostly foreign mercenaries who promptly surrendered, its men fleeing in disorder across the Narva River. It was one of the most humiliating military defeats in Russian history, and Charles XII, apparently concluding that Russia was no longer a serious threat, turned his attention westward to deal with Poland. That decision by Charles XII was arguably the most consequential mistake of the 18th century. It gave Peter 9 years. 9 years to rebuild his army from the ground up, to conscript new soldiers, to train new officers, to cast new cannon from the bronze of melted church bells, to build new fortresses and new supply lines across the vast Russian interior. The army that emerged from those 9 years was not the army of Narva. It was something new, something that combined European drill and European artillery with Russian endurance, Russian numbers, and a logistical system capable of sustaining campaigns across distances that would have broken any Western European force. When Charles XII finally turned back east and invaded Russia in 1708, he was walking into a trap he did not know existed. The Battle of Poltava in July 1709 is one of those moments where you can feel the axis of European history shifting. Charles XII, whose army had been weakened by a catastrophic winter, by the defection of the Ukrainian Cossack hetman Ivan Mazepa, and by the destruction of his supply depot at Baturin, attacked the Russian fortified camp with an army that was exhausted, undersupplied, and outnumbered. Peter's forces, by contrast, were fresh, well-equipped, and fighting on ground they had chosen. The battle lasted perhaps 2 hours. The Swedish army was destroyed. Charles XII fled to Ottoman territory, and Peter, standing on the battlefield afterward, is reported to have toasted the Swedish officers he had captured as his teachers in the art of war. Whether or not he said exactly those words, the sentiment captures something real. Poltava was the proof of concept for everything Peter had built since 1700, and it announced to every court in Europe that Russia was now a great power. But Poltava also revealed something darker about how Peter's reforms actually worked. The new army had been built on conscription that was essentially indistinguishable from a form of enslavement. Peasant recruits served for life, or until they were too broken to fight. The officer corps was being professionalized, but the rank and file were treated as expendable material. The foundries that cast Peter's cannon ran on serf labor. The shipyards at Voronezh and later at St. Petersburg were built by conscripted workers, tens of thousands of whom died in the marshes of the Neva Delta. When Peter reformed Russia, he did not liberate its population, he mobilized it. There is a crucial difference. The founding of St. Petersburg in 107 is perhaps the single most audacious act of Peter's reign, and it is worth pausing on what it actually meant. Peter chose to build his new capital on land that was at the time of construction still technically Swedish territory, on a marshy delta at the mouth of the Neva River, where the Gulf of Finland begins. The climate was brutal, the ground was waterlogged, and there was essentially no existing infrastructure. Tens of thousands of workers, many of them conscripted serfs and prisoners of war, were driven into the marshes to drive piles and lay foundations. Estimates of the death toll during construction vary widely and are genuinely uncertain, but contemporaries spoke of the city being built on bones, and that description was not entirely metaphorical. Peter was building not just a city, but a statement. Russia now faced west. Russia now had a window onto Europe, which is exactly the phrase he used. The old capital, Moscow, with its Kremlin and its golden domes and its Byzantine street plan, looked east and south toward the steppe and the Orthodox heartland. St. Petersburg looked north and west, toward the Baltic and beyond it, toward Amsterdam and London. The administrative reforms that Peter pushed through in the second decade of his reign were equally radical in intention and equally mixed in result. In 1711, he created the Senate, a governing body of 9 members that was supposed to function as a supreme administrative council when the Tsar was absent on campaign. In 1718 and 1719, he replaced the old prikazy, the chaotic system of overlapping administrative offices that had accumulated since the medieval period, with a series of colleges modeled on the Swedish system, colleges of foreign affairs, war, the admiralty, revenue, justice, and so on. Each college was a board of officials, with a Swedish or German expert sitting alongside Russian members to ensure that the new procedures were actually followed. This was a direct transplant of a foreign institutional model, and it worked after a fashion, though the colleges were plagued by corruption, understaffing, and the persistent Russian administrative habit of ignoring rules that inconvenienced powerful men. The church reform of 1721 was perhaps the most symbolically loaded of all Peter's changes. When Patriarch Adrian died in 1700, Peter simply did not appoint a successor. For 21 years, the Russian Orthodox Church had no patriarch. Then in 1721, Peter replaced the patriarchate entirely with the Holy Synod, a collegial body of bishops supervised by a lay official, the chief procurator, who reported directly to the Tsar. The Synod was modeled, loosely, on the Lutheran Church governance Peter had observed in Protestant Germany. The effect was to subordinate the Church entirely to the state, to turn the institution that had for centuries served as a counterweight to secular power, however imperfectly, into a department of government. The Church's vast landholdings were increasingly subject to state control. Priests were required to report confessions to the authorities if they revealed threats to the state, a provision that struck at the heart of the sacramental relationship between confessor and penitent. Monasteries were restricted in their ability to accept new monks. Peter regarded monasticism with particular contempt, seeing it as a refuge for idlers at a time when Russia needed every able body it could find. The reaction to all of this was not simply passive. It is important not to caricature Peter's subjects as a mass of silent, suffering peasants. There was active resistance, and it took many forms. The Old Believers, the schismatic movement that had split from the official church in the 1660s over liturgical reforms, saw Peter as the Antichrist, literally and without irony. Their apocalyptic interpretation of his reign was not fringe theology, but a widely shared conviction among millions of Russians who lived in the forests and on the frontiers, beyond the reach of Peter's reforming officials. The beard tax and the Western dress codes were not merely inconvenient to the Old Believers. They were signs of the end times evidence that the Tsar had sold Russia to the devil of Western rationalism. The Old Believer communities that Peter drove further underground would survive in various forms until the 20th century, and their existence is a reminder that the Europeanization of Russia was always, at most, the Europeanization of its elites. Even among the elites, resistance was real. The case of Tsarevich Alexei, Peter's son and heir, is one of the most disturbing episodes of the reign, and it reveals something important about the psychological cost of Peter's project. Alexei was everything his father was not: quiet, religious, attached to the old ways, more comfortable with priests and icons than with shipwrights and artillery officers. He fled to Austria in 1716, apparently hoping to find refuge with his wife's Habsburg relatives until Peter died. Peter lured him back with promises of clemency, then had him arrested, tortured, and tried for treason. Alexei died in the Peter and Paul fortress in St. Petersburg in June 1718, almost certainly from the effects of torture, though the exact circumstances remain disputed. He was 28 years old. Peter had killed his own heir because that heir represented the Russia he was trying to destroy. The personal dimension of this is almost unbearable to contemplate, but the political dimension is equally stark. Peter's reforms were not popular even within his own family, and the violence required to sustain them was not incidental but structural. The table of ranks, introduced in 1722, is one of those reforms that looks on the surface like a straightforward piece of Enlightenment rationalism and turns out, on closer examination, to be something more complicated. The table created a hierarchy of 14 ranks in the military, civil, and court services, and it stipulated that advancement through the hierarchy would be based on merit and service rather than birth. Any man who reached a certain rank would automatically acquire noble status. This was, in principle, a meritocratic revolution. It opened the aristocracy to men of talent, regardless of family background, and it tied the entire nobility to the service state. But in practice, the table of ranks reinforced rather than undermined the power of the existing nobility, because the existing nobility had the education, the connections, and the resources to advance through the ranks far more easily than men of lower birth. And it created a new form of dependency. Russian nobles now held their status not from ancient lineage, but from the Tsar's service, which meant that the Tsar's power over them was, if anything, more complete than before. The economic dimension of Peter's reforms is often underemphasized in popular accounts, but it was central to his project. Russia in 1700 had almost no manufacturing sector by European standards. Peter set out to create one, largely through state direction. He established ironworks in the Urals, textile mills near Moscow, and armaments factories wherever the raw materials and labor could be assembled. By the end of his reign, Russia was producing enough iron to supply its own military needs and to export a surplus to Western Europe. The Ural ironworks in particular would remain the backbone of Russian heavy industry well into the 19th century. But the labor force for these enterprises was, again, essentially servile. Peter assigned entire villages of state peasants to work the mines and foundries, creating what historians call possessional serfs, a category of unfree labor, specifically attached to industrial enterprises. The Industrial Revolution that Peter initiated was built not on free wage labor, as in England, but on an extension of serfdom into new sectors of the economy. The long-term consequences of this choice were profound and deeply damaging. Education was another arena where Peter's ambitions outran his resources. He established the School of Mathematical and Navigational Sciences in Moscow in 1701, the Naval Academy in St. Petersburg in 1715, and a network of cipher schools in provincial towns designed to provide basic technical education for the sons of nobles and clergymen. He sent hundreds of young Russians abroad to study in Holland, England, and Italy, and he recruited foreign specialists, engineers, doctors, architects, and scientists to work in Russia. The St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences, founded in 1724, just months before Peter's death, was intended to be Russia's answer to the Royal Society of London or the French Académie des Sciences. For its first decades, it was staffed almost entirely by foreign scholars, because Russia had not yet produced enough educated men to fill its chairs. The Academy was a real institution that did real scientific work, but it was also, in its early years, a kind of Potemkin village of the intellect, a European facade maintained by imported Europeans. What did ordinary Russians make of all this? The sources are frustratingly thin when it comes to the experience of the peasant majority, who constituted perhaps 85% of the population and who were largely untouched by the cultural reforms aimed at the nobility. The beard tax, the Western dress codes, the new calendar, the mixed-gender assemblies, these were elite concerns. What the peasantry experienced of Peter's reign was conscription, increased taxation, labor obligations, and the intensification of serfdom. The soul tax of 1724, which replaced the old household tax with a per capita tax on all male serfs, was a fiscal innovation that simultaneously tightened the grip of serfdom by requiring landlords to be responsible for delivering their serfs' tax payments. The gap between Peter's Europeanizing rhetoric and the lived reality of Russian serfdom was not a paradox that troubled him greatly. He was building a state, not a society. The question of what Peter actually achieved, as opposed to what he intended, is one that historians have debated with remarkable intensity from his own time to the present. The nationalist historian Mikhail Pogodin in the 19th century argued that Peter's reforms represented a complete rupture, a revolution from above that divided Russian history into a before and an after. The Slavophiles, writing in the 1830s and 1840s, agreed that a rupture had occurred, but judged it catastrophically negative. Peter had severed Russia from its organic Orthodox civilization and condemned it to a false, borrowed Western identity that sat uneasily on a fundamentally Slavic soul. Sergei Soloviev and later Vasily Klyuchevsky, the great liberal historians of the late 19th century, took a more nuanced view, seeing Peter's reforms as the necessary, if painful, acceleration of processes that were already underway in 17th century Russia, processes of Westernization that had begun under Peter's father Alexis and his half-sister Sophia's regent government. On this reading, Peter did not create something entirely new, but rather pushed existing tendencies to an extreme with characteristic violence and impatience. The Soviet historiography of Peter is fascinating in its own right, because Soviet historians faced a genuine ideological problem. Peter was an autocrat, a slaveholder, a man who worked his subjects to death in the service of state power. But he was also, by any measure, a modernizer, a man who had dragged Russia into the modern world through sheer force of will. Stalin, who was himself a modernizer of sorts, and who was himself dragging Russia through an agonizing transformation in the 1930s, had a particular affinity for Peter, and Soviet historians were expected to reflect this. The standard Soviet interpretation presented Peter as a progressive historical force, a man who had objectively served the interests of Russian national development, even if his methods were those of a feudal autocrat. The peasants who died building St. Petersburg were the price of progress. The serf workers of the Ural foundries were the ancestors of the Soviet proletariat. The parallels with Stalin's own industrialization drive were not accidental, and they were not entirely lost on Soviet readers. What the Soviet interpretation missed and what post-Soviet Russian historiography has been slowly recovering is the sheer contingency of what Peter built. His reforms were not inevitable, they were the product of specific decisions made by a specific man under specific pressures, and they could easily have gone differently. The Northern War could have ended badly, Charles XII could have won at Poltava, Alexei could have outlived his father and reversed the reforms. The St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences could have remained a foreign curiosity rather than the seed of a genuine Russian scientific tradition. The fact that Peter's Russia became the template for subsequent Russian imperial development was not written in the stars. It was the result of violence, luck, and the particular genius, because genius is not too strong a word, of a man who was also, by any reasonable assessment, a tyrant. The long-term consequences of Peter's reforms rippled through Russian history in ways that are still visible today. The service nobility that Peter created, bound to the state by the table of ranks, became the social foundation of the Russian Empire for the next 2 centuries. It was this class, educated in the European tradition, speaking French in their drawing rooms and Russian in the kitchen, that produced Pushkin and Turgenev and Tolstoy, that staffed the imperial bureaucracy and officer corps, and that eventually in the 19th century began to ask whether the gap between their Europeanized culture and the peasant reality beneath them was not a wound that needed healing. The intelligentsia, the peculiarly Russian social formation of educated men and women alienated from both the autocracy above them and the peasantry below them, was in a very real sense Peter's creation. He had produced the conditions for their existence by creating a Europeanized elite in a non-European society. The tension that Peter installed at the heart of Russian political culture between the imperative to modernize and the resistance of deep social and religious structures did not resolve itself in his lifetime or in the lifetimes of his immediate successors. Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796, continued Peter's project of Europeanization in the cultural sphere with genuine sophistication, corresponding with Voltaire and Diderot, founding the Hermitage, and commissioning the falconet statue of Peter that still stands in St. Petersburg, the bronze horseman of Pushkin's poem. But Catherine also presided over the final consolidation of serfdom, the crushing of Pugachev's rebellion in 1774 and 1775, and the expansion of noble privilege at the expense of any serious social reform. The Europeanization of Russia remained, as it had been under Peter, a project of the state and the elite, not of the society as a whole. The contradiction exploded, finally, in 1917, when the entire edifice that Peter had begun constructing in 1698 collapsed under the weight of a world war it could not sustain. The Romanov dynasty, which Peter had transformed from a Muscovite tsardom into a European-style empire, ended in a basement in Yekaterinburg. The Bolsheviks who replaced it were, in one sense, the ultimate Westernizers. Marxism was, after all, a Western European intellectual product, and Lenin and his colleagues had spent years in European exile absorbing it. But the Soviet state they built also recapitulated, in terrifying new forms, the Petrine logic of forced modernization from above, of state power mobilizing a reluctant society toward goals it had not chosen, of violence as the instrument of transformation. St. Petersburg itself, renamed Petrograd in 1914 and Leningrad in 1924, became the symbol of everything that Peter's project had been and everything it had cost. The city of white knights and Baroque facades, built on the bones of conscripted serfs, the city that had been Russia's window onto Europe for 2 centuries, was besieged by German armies from 1941 to 1944 in one of the most catastrophic episodes of the Second World War. Nearly 1 million people died in the Leningrad blockade, many of them from starvation, in a city that had been built, from the very beginning, as a monument to the idea that Russia could be made to look like Europe. The irony is almost too much to bear. Peter died in February 1725 at the age of 52 of what was probably uremia complicated by bladder and kidney problems, though the exact cause of death has been disputed. He died without naming a successor because he had issued a decree in 1722 allowing the Tsar to name his own heir, and then had never gotten around to doing it. The man who had remade Russia could not manage the most basic act of dynastic continuity. In the decades after his death, the throne passed through a succession of rulers, some capable, some catastrophically incompetent, each one inheriting the state Peter had built and the contradictions he had embedded in it. The Petrine reforms were never reversed, not really, but they were also never completed. They remained a permanent work in progress, a permanent source of tension between the Russia that Peter had tried to create and the Russia that actually existed. What Peter the Great ultimately demonstrated is something that every modernizing autocrat since his time has had to confront. You can change the institutions of a society by force, and you can change its surface culture by decree, but you cannot change its underlying social relationships, its religious imagination, its deep habits of deference and resistance, without transforming the conditions of life for the people who live in it. Peter built a navy and an army and a capital city and an academy of sciences. He did not build a middle class, a free press, an independent judiciary, or a culture of civic participation. And the absence of those things meant that everything he built rested, ultimately, on the same foundation it had always rested on, the unlimited power of the autocrat, backed by the unlimited coercibility of the serf. When that foundation cracked in 1917, it took everything with it. The Bronze Horseman still stands in Senate Square in St. Petersburg, the great equestrian statue of Peter rearing above the city he built. Pushkin wrote about it in 1833 in a poem that is one of the masterpieces of Russian literature. And what he understood with the clarity of a great artist is that the statue is not simply a monument to a great ruler. It is a monument to the violence of the idea. The horse rears, the rider commands, and below them, in Pushkin's poem, a small man, a clerk, a nobody, is swept away by the flood that Peter's city was always vulnerable to, because it was built on a delta, in defiance of nature, by the will of one man. The flood comes back, it always comes back. And the question that Pushkin was really asking, the question that Peter's entire reign poses to anyone who looked at it honestly, is whether the man on the horse ever really understood what he was riding over.